Now we're going to talk about Islam. And here we enter into a segment that, in a sense, is the most relevant, if relevance is a criterion, which sort of is, to today's world, because these controversies that play out today, Shiism versus Sunni, for example, the nature of Islam, its appeal as a religion on a world scale, are obviously established in the period that we're talking about. They're established slowly. One of the things that you'll have noticed from the assignment is that the author, Berkey, emphasizes very much that Islam is slow in formation, that it's not fully grown as this militant movement with a set of rules in 632, the year that Muhammad dies. And because of that, then it's not to be understood as some militant, conversion-oriented, jihad-centric religion from the start. I said at one point, when we were summarizing the end of the Roman Empire, that there were three heirs to the Roman Empire. One was the church, ironic because of course, the church had grown up persecuted by the empire. The other was the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. Remember that it called itself simply the Roman Empire. So that's the most clear claim being staked to succession to the Roman Empire, and that the third was Islam. And a couple of you said, well, Islam, that's the most surprising of all, actually, and I didn't really elaborate at that time, and that's not the center of what we're going to be talking about, because time moves on. We're in the 7th century. The collapse of the Roman Empire in the West is established 2 centuries earlier, but Islam, although developed in Arabia outside of the Roman Empire, and although very strong in places like Persia or the western part of India, would in many respects take up the inheritance of the Roman and Byzantine empires. The conquests on the Mediterranean in the east and in the south, its architectural and artistic style, its administrative structure, and not least, the translation and elaborations of Greek science, medicine, and other academic forms, including, for example, the translation of Aristotle, and the influence of Aristotle would be signs of, evidence of the significance of Islam within it's pointless to debate whether it's the Western tradition or what the Western tradition means, but within the classical legacy, within what it means to say that Rome as a polity ceased to exist in the West, and yet the classical world has continued to influence society and ideas to this day. So in talking about the history of Islam, one is inevitably going to be emphasizing its revolutionary nature. And so I'm going to go against the reading in some sense, or the reading is intended to go against the conventional way of presenting the early history of Islam. And that can be sometimes annoying. The writer is cautioning you against views you never had. Well, the writer keeps on saying, well, we should not think that this, and I hadn't thought that. Just tell me what you think happened in early Islam. My apologies for that. Writers are always writing against other writers. Scholars are always writing against a prevailing interpretation. Berkey is a continuist, and that is the scholarly consensus now, arguing against this notion of Islam bursting forth like some kind of pent-up explosion in Arabia. But Arabia is off the map. Islam as a movement, and certainly the Arab conquests, are unpredictable events. They may be understandable later in terms of developments in the Near East, both religious and cultural. But up until the 7th century, Arabia was on the periphery of the two great controlling empires to its north, namely Persia and Rome. And we are taking Byzantium as the heir of Rome in this sense. The problem with Arabia is that it is really dry. And before the discovery of oil, or more precisely, before the discovery that oil was useful, important, and valuable, it was a strikingly impoverished land in terms of natural resources. A terrible land, as Isaiah the prophet says. Isaiah 21:1, the burden of the desert of the sea. As whirlwinds in the south pass through it, so it cometh from the desert, from a terrible land. Now, Isaiah actually grew up in what most of us would consider to be pretty dry circumstances. The Eastern Mediterranean, modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, are hot and dry compared to bounteous climes like New Haven. So the Eastern Mediterranean, however, is a land of fertile oases, river valleys like the famed Tigris-Euphrates Fertile Crescent area, coastal cities with commerce, whereas Arabia is essentially a vast expanse of barely habitable terrain. It is isolated by the sea on 3 sides. It has very few natural harbors. There are no lakes, no forests, no grasslands even, and no rivers that run year-round. The only intrinsically favorable part of it is the southwest corner, modern Yemen. This was in the ancient world, or at least to the Roman geographers, Arabia Felix, happy Arabia, nice Arabia. And indeed, there were 2 kingdoms that emerged here around 1000 BC, harbors, oases, and these 2 kingdoms controlled the spice and incense trade from India and from the Horn of Africa. These are 2 extremely valuable kinds of products for religious, gastronomic, and medicinal purposes. And most of the spices come from India, and most of the incense comes from modern Somalia, Ethiopia, places along the Red Sea. By the time of Muhammad, however, southern Arabia's best days had passed. And Muhammad is, of course, from central and, in the sense of its orientation, really northern Arabia. The worst desert in Arabia is the south. So just when you get out of Yemen going northeast, you come to an area that still bears the not really encouraging name, the Empty Quarter. This is really Syria's no oases desert. Further north, however, in places like Mecca or Medina, there is enough water for settlement, though not enough for agriculture. A key event in the history of Arabia is the domestication of the camel, which can be situated around 1000 BC. Arabia outside of the Yemenite kingdoms was mostly nomadic, though there were trading cities, of which the most famous are Mecca and Medina. These cities were rather cosmopolitan. They had Arabs and other peoples. They had Christians, some of whom were Arabs, some of whom were not, and Jews, many of whom were also Arabs. They controlled overland trade, again from further east, bearing exotic products like spices from India, organizing caravans. At times they would form kingdoms, at times there would be Arab kingdoms in the north, but generally these are feuding societies organized along tribal lines. Looked at from the Roman or Persian Empire, Arabia was a little bit like the forests of Germany. A hostile terrain from the Roman point of view, Persian point of view, inhabited by useful but presumably barbarian and presumably not very interesting people. But this is the point of view of the Bible as well. They're primitive people bearing interesting products, inhabiting a land that's not worth having, not worth invading, not worth owning, not worth dealing with. The first mention of Arabs seems to be 854 BC, when, according to a Syrian inscription, a certain Gindibu, the Arab, contributed 1,000 camels to forces revolting against the Assyrians. The Arabs, henceforth, after 854, are mentioned often in Babylonian and Persian texts. They're always frontiersmen or people inhabiting a land beyond a frontier. Questions so far?